Welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 195. Before we get started, just a quick logistical reminder, please follow Identity Office Hours on LinkedIn or YouTube, whichever platform you prefer. Our topic today is the crazy road of authorization. Are we really ready for agents? Our guest today is Bhavna Bhatnagar, 25-year veteran, Sun Microsystems and Oracle alum, also on the original OpenSSO team, and most recently fractional CTO and VP of engineering at Vigorsoft. Welcome, Bhavna.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for the kind introduction. Really looking forward to this conversation.
So before we dive into authorization, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your career trajectory. How did you actually get started and end up here?
Absolutely, yeah. So obviously, I started my career as an engineer, grew through the ranks, took a passion towards identity space, became the architect of the policy engine of the OpenSSO product, like you mentioned, and that led me to a world of identity, which I've loved always. I've worked in larger enterprises, like you mentioned, Sun, Oracle, IBM. I also joined scale ups. In my second chapter, I wanted to explore, how do you help scale ups to get to a point of having a mature identity, security, access control setups organization. So I moved to engineering leadership roles where I led large scale teams, about 80 plus teams at Rivian recently, and Procore after that. Um, I have recently been spending a lot of time with the working groups, OpenID, specs committee, because I realized that we have a lot of tools and widgets to work with, but the standardization is something which we land up losing focus on. So I've been spending a lot of time on that, especially with NHIs. The whole gamut of things have changed. So a lot of time has been spent there. I'm doing a lot of advisory and fractional roles. So really enjoying myself in a different scenario right now, and let's see how things go from here.
And it's really an exciting time right now. I feel because the landscape is really changing. I feel like sometimes we have periods of stability where we think we have it all figured out, and then we're faced with these new challenges that just make us seem like everything's complete chaos. And I feel like AI agents have really shifted the landscape a lot. And I was listening to a podcast which described how people respond to disasters. And the first response is denial, like, no way, dude, that's not happening. That can't be real. And then people start to talk to their friends and family to get confirmation that the disaster that they're seeing is real. And it takes a human an average of like 15 like confirmations before they're like, no, that really is happening. Um,
Absolutely,
and then
absolutely.
and then there's the third phase is one of two options. In option one is decisive action. Okay, this disaster is real. I'm going to leave my house now. Or the opposite of that, which is decisive inaction, where they basically are overwhelmed with choices, don't know what to do, and end up resisting doing anything at all. And so I'm wondering, if we model this AI transformation, like humans to respond to disasters, where do you think we are in this trajectory?
So like you've put it really well. I think we have mastered, not, I shouldn't say mastered, we have at least have enough maturity to understand the authentication landscape. So we know, like, somebody needs to be authenticated, prove who they are. But when it comes to giving access control, I think we are just, we know ODZ exists as a term, but in reality, a lot of code, ODZ is really a bunch of if-else statements, and then cross your fingers and think that, okay, I think I have it figured. People have progressed and said, okay, yeah, I think, if else is not working out, so let's create some static policies. The whole trajectory has been creation of policies. People are aware of role-based access control because that maps really well to organization structures. So, static policies, there has been thought around dynamic policies, and, hey, we need to have a policy language. But I think the it's a very complex space, and people are even the human space is not really well solved, if you ask me. So with the advent of agents, I think the problem is multifold. So the way I like to state it is that, an AI agent without a policy engine is almost like a very confident intern, who has root access. So it's pretty much that. And we need to fix that problem, and we need to be aware of that problem first before we start handling the smaller fixes.
At IAW, where we had an opportunity to chat, and then last night I was at a founder dinner in Austin, and I was sitting next to a guy who was telling me, he told me he gave all of his credentials to his OpenClaw agent that was running on, he thought it was secure because the agent was running on a dedicated server. Um, and then I kept saying, but you but it's connected to the internet and you gave it your credentials and it can impersonate you. So the fact that it's running on an individual server doesn't really give me a lot of comfort. What would happen if it does something wrong? And even at IAW, I heard about this case of people giving their credentials to the agent and the agent impersonating them. But that does seem to be sort of the pattern today. And I'm wondering if you think enterprises are underestimating the challenges that that type of delegation is going to be when it comes to not only controlling security, but accountability when things go wrong.
Absolutely. So, we all, like I said, we know what is authentication. We at least understand what is authorization. The accountability gap exists because now we are having agents which are running on behalf of users. And by trying to do the on behalf of flow, we are really handing over our credentials. Like you said, hey, here are my credentials, run with it. But unfortunately, that really is leading to privilege escalation. And so think of it this way, right? Agents are not going rogue. We are not aware of the non-deterministic behavior of the agents. So our policies and the controls around how the agents need to behave needs to take change. So we can define a policy saying, this happens and the agent needs to do this. But what happens when the agent has a non-deterministic plan? How can we create a policy for something we don't know that exists? I mean, we don't know what the agent will do. So I think because of that, one of the thoughts which we need to really focus on is not have long-standing privileges. When you create your tokens, they are not like live tokens for a very long time. There is a very big focus we need to give on scope attenuation, by which I mean, um, you give the agent and I'm putting it in a very simple English and not in technical terms, but give the agent as much privileges as you think the agent needs to do its job. And if the agent needs to spawn a sub agent, then it needs to give less to the sub agent and lesser to its own sub agent. So the scope needs to be attenuated. And there are tools, and we have biscuits and macaroons, and our authorization world is full of standards which we can use and implement to make sure that transaction tokens, for example, rich authorization context. So we can use all of these tools and tricks to make sure that we are putting some guardrails around the agent. I have some thoughts around the governance about all of this, but yeah, we can get to that. I'm sure that's a passion topic for you as well.
Yeah. So I think, we can break this conversation into three parts, is like new challenges, actually identifying agents, then the authorization piece, how do we make policies? And then maybe the governance piece, which is how do we know we have the right policies, or how do we know we can react when things go wrong and hold the entities accountable? But let's start with the identity piece. Or Weiss, the founder of Permit.io, I'm a big fan of Permit and Or Weiss, but he said to me once that the reason why authorization is possible, progress on authorization is more possible now than it was, let's say, 15 years ago, was that the identity layer has become more mature and stable. And I think that's true with regard to humans. Like, I actually think we're better at authenticating humans than we ever dreamed possible in 15 years ago, because of the inclusion of passkeys into the hardware operating system and browser, we've been able to cheat and, in a way, have better security and better usability and better deployability than we thought we'd be able to achieve in the past. And wallets have also done a lot to enable secure enrollment, like the first time you're presenting your credential, not authentication, but enrollment. So
Yes.
the human identity part, I feel like, yeah, we've gotten really good at that. So I agree with Orr in that respect. But on the software identity side, I feel like we actually have more uncertainty than ever, because we used to have a very simple world where we had SPs and IDPs. And the
Yes.
SPs might have asymmetric credentials. And then we went to OpenID Connect. We had a similar situation where, okay, now we don't just have websites, we also have mobile applications or native applications. But now we've sort of moved into this next layer where it's clear that the client ID doesn't identify all the subagents that an agent might run. Um, and there's been an explosion of solutions in the identity space to address how these subagents would be, what we would use to identify them, what tokens we would use, what identifiers we would use. Um, so I really feel like we don't have that stability. And can we move forward in the authorization space on the assumption that we'll figure out that software identity later, but we don't want to delay the authorization sort of progress now, that the identity layer has maybe become unstable again.
Yeah. No, I mean, and you are raising really valid concerns because number one, right, like you rightly said, number of humans are limited, and they have predictability as against the number of. So I mean, the reason I say limited, okay, it's not about the population, but really a human being can spawn multiple agents. So with that ratio, you have more agents out there in the cloud, more workloads than a human being. And to be able to say, so two things: the number and the predictability. We rely on humans nature of predictability. They want to access something, we put an access control guardrails, and hopefully we have solved the problems. But like you said, with agents, we have too many of these, and we need agents to do work on behalf of users, but agents also are the clients to spawn agents. So really, how do you solve this problem of, do we really need an identity for the agent? There are tools, there are like specs. You have the Spiffy, you have the Spire. You can have SDIDs for all your agents, and there are standards. And when I'm advising some of the organizations, there is no one thought or how to solve this problem. Some of them are using a Spiffy Spire for client identification, or somebody's using verified credentials. Um, there is, I also see, solutions with respect to wallets, where there people are creating, agentic identity and trying to store them in wallets in some way using cryptographic provenance. So it's a complex place. And to your question on, should we go ahead with authorization without solving the part of, do we know who the agent is? I think no, because at the end of the day, if we don't know who the agent is and which agent is doing something on behalf of a user, the accountability gap will increase. Now, I know you're smiling. Before that, we've also been exploring the concept of ephemeral agents, right? I mean, you can have these very short-lived agents which can come in, do their bit, and disappear. Now, the open question is, do we need to know who did that, or is the parent agent who needs to be just held accountable for, hey, you spawned an agent and something happened and now that agent is dead? So there is this whole life cycle of agent which we need to figure out still, right? Like in human beings, you have a joiner, mover, lever. So agents need to have a similar thing. When were agents born, created, owned? When did things change, and how do we define a change in an agent? Does the change mean the owner changed? Does the change mean that backend LLM changed? Or does the change mean that the skill sets changed of the agent, right? So what is the change of the agent? And similarly, how do you define an agent has gone rogue? It's a rogue agent, fine, but Is it because it has crossed the guardrails, the white boundary, and we see a risky behavior, or is it something else that we decide the agent is wrong? So to answer the question in short, I think knowing who did what, even if it's an agent, is super important.
Yeah, and I know you were in the session with Sarah Caccetti, and what she was talking about Claudry's spawn, like not Claudry the
Yeah.
agent, but Claudry's sub-agents, and I think that's sort of a good metaphor for these sub-agents, and um, yeah, and it's clear there is more software than humans. Like even if I look at my mobile phone and I see how many apps are on my phone, you quickly get to the point where there's a lot more software than humans. And humans are slow. Like we don't process at machine speed. Um, but I would like to. My take on it is that we do actually need to move ahead with authorization because um, the the challenges. I just don't think we can wait for this whole. It would be nice to be lockstep and say let's figure out software authentication and then let's move to authorization. But I don't think we have the luxury of doing that anymore because I think we have to move in parallel where we say, well, assuming we had good software authentication, identification, and authentication, um, how would we need to create policies and manage it? And those policies, I think, my theory is that identity has dropped in priority with regard to um, policy.
Hmm.
So in the workforce, we have policies about what people can do based on their roles.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like in agentic, things have shifted a little bit. So we're not talking about humans going to a website and trying to get to this part, access this part of the website, which is only available to a certain role. But MCP has sort of become the middleware for agents, where different business units or third parties are exposing MCP servers connected to data.
Hmm.
And when you look at how they expose those MCP servers, they're normally like, here's the tool, the type of tool call you can make. And it's implicit that that's connected to some type of data. If it's a sales tool, it's connected to sales data, or if it's you
Right.
know, yeah. And so the resource is the data, and then we're seeing these lists of MCP sort of actions or skills, let's say, and it doesn't seem like this maps to our old model of RBAC very very well. So maybe you can talk about some of the challenges that we're facing on the authorization side as we change to this new model of how MCP becomes this new middleware
Abs-
um, for
Yeah.
organizations.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you rightly said that in the authorization world, we originally always, like, and I'm going back in history because there's a lot of evolution in the authorization world. And even now, CIDR is written with the tuple concept of you have a principle, resource, action, and context in mind. But there's always a resource-centric view when you are writing policies, and it's always been the case. You have a resource, and you're not trying to protect that resource from that subject via the policy definition. But I think the whole viewpoint has changed. It's no more about you're not guarding resource access, you're actually guarding intent access, so to speak, right? So agents come with an intent, they come with a plan, and we are writing policies for that intent and the plan as against the literal resources which the agents will access. So, like you're saying, an agent may go and access multiple MCP servers, may invoke multiple, tools and do the work. So, if we land up hypothetically writing a policy for each of the tool accesses, and if we think we are done, we are not, because it's possible that even though we have secured the resource accesses, the intent has still gone rogue. I mean, the granularity or the guardrail of, hey, the agent can use this API but cannot do more than $50 through this transaction is not captured through the resource control. So having that intent is super important. And you are at the IIW. we all are aware that the intent aware policy authorization needs to happen, and it's a mapping, and it's a mapping of what an agent can do as a capability versus what the intent is, that the plan which is generated. And I see a lot of people trying to use mathematical formulas, graphs to figure out the deviation, and I'm going a little technical here, but going into the deviation of the intent versus capability, and raising a risk score. And if the risk score has gone higher than what the wipe boundary or the guardrail boundary of the agent is, then we have architectural patterns of human in the loop. That's when the human in the loop is being pulled in and say, okay, this seems like this agent is either doing something which it's not asked to do, or it's doing something in terms of maybe it has gone rogue. So this is where a human intervention is needed. So uh, it is definitely no more can you access this resource. It's about, you started off with doing something. We do not evaluate the policy just at a starting point. It's a continuous evaluation. You read all the risk signals, you keep figuring out the drift between intent and capability, and based on your continuous evaluation, you let the agent complete the plan. That is the high level thinking in terms of how do you do intent aware authorization. Now, implementation is dime a dozen, and I always feel that from specs perspective, we have landed up creating a lot of basic building blocks on how this can be done. It's just a matter of using them and making sure that we are aware of the fact that we are dealing with non-human identities who have non-deterministic plans. So that's my thought here.
When I hear about intent, I think intent is normally expressed in natural language, like or maybe Markdown or English or something, English like. And it reminds me that guardrails aren't all created equal,
Hmm.
because we have some guardrails, like you mentioned, transaction value can't exceed $50.
Right.
That can be, that's a very sort of enforceable limitation. And then we might have a policy like Bhavna prefers a medium unless it runs small, in which case she wants a large.
Yes.
Um, and maybe that's a little more squishy. And so I feel like there's needs to be a differentiation in terms of policy on, let's say, things that are constitutionally important. Um, as Rohit would say, never give the human more than this amount of radiation. um, and things that are like less important that might get messed up, like maybe we send Bhavna the wrong t-shirt, but the impact is not that great. We fix the model and we have her ship back the t-shirt and we
Right.
fix it after the fact. So I'm just curious, do you see the conflation of those types of policy constraints or guardrails, let's say? What's your definition of guardrails? And do you see a range for these guardrails?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you raise a very valid point. I mean, some guardrails are easily implementable. For example, the example which I gave, yeah, if I know for sure that this agent cannot do anything beyond $50, yeah, easily enforceable, I guess. But if you have, a situation, for example, let's think of an agent which is doing a Kubernetes infra control, right? I mean, you have an agent which is monitoring your Kubernetes pods and is basically told that if you see latency spikes, then scale a new pod, and it does exactly that. But what if there is a denial of service attack, and you have like basically the latency spike is being created as an attack? Then in which case this agent can go rogue and create 1,000 pods, increasing the cost for the company and so on and so forth. So there needs to be, it's not like a linear transaction, like if this happens, don't do that. There needs to be an evaluation. Like I mentioned, there has to be a continuous evaluation of state and the increasing risk to be able to say that this doesn't make sense. And like you mentioned, um, there are a lot of policy, and we talked about the natural language part of the policies. We have a lot of policy languages. We have Rego. We started off with PyAgents, which came with the Rego, and then I have not used Polar too much, but I think Polar also exists as a language. Recently, we've been hearing about Cedar, and Cedar. I'm hearing a lot of good things. AWS is open source, and it's it has like finite analyzability. So basically, you can um, even if you refactor the permissions, you're not changing things, and there is a finite element to it, and that's what is good about Cedar. And also, I believe, I would like to hear your thoughts here as well. Our traditional model of, we have a PPP and we have a PEP, all that has to be rethought of. I know you are using Cedar Link somewhere, and Cedar Link can be used on the edge to do like quick local policy evaluations. So you're not running back to the larger authorization server to say, is this right or wrong? So it's pretty quick response. So along with language, I think the infrastructure elements, or rather the pieces which we have been using for policy creation and evaluation, even though the pieces haven't changed, we still have a policy decision point, we have a policy evaluation point, we have an administration points. It's where they are sitting in our cloud infrastructure has changed. The thought should change if it hasn't changed, right? So that's where I think a combination of easy to write policies, deterministic way of interpreting those policies, and the data being locally available gives us the fuel to do policy eval quickly and locally.
Yeah. I do hate the term PEP. I
Okay.
think I call the PEP the application.
Oh,
The
really?
thing the thing that is actually deciding whether or not to give you access, that's the application. Um, the PEP was this awkward term when we had web servers, like, back when it was about web access management, we would
Mhm.
want to insert a filter or a plugin into the web server, um, I forget the name of the Microsoft web server or Apache, but you'd want to plug into those things,
Yeah.
and then that plugin would then talk to the PDP, and we would call that a PEP. Um, but in a way, though, really, it was just the plugin was making the application aware of able to make a policy decision call. Um, and so I don't know. I really think the whole PEP architecture is just wrong, and that it's really the application, whether it's a mobile app, an agent, a piece of infrastructure like a gateway, a backend application, or a database.
Mhm.
All of those things consume decisions from the policy decision point. And now, like in the old days, like you'd have to use some type of weird protocol. Like SiteMinder had some weird protocol between the PEP and the PDP. Now we're better at network protocols, and so we have authzen.
Saying, yeah.
If we need a JSON REST API, we have authzen. But even beyond that, even if our PDP has some JSON REST interface or some other interface, it's normally published and easy for application developers to use. So I don't know. I really hate the PEP. I think PEP should be RIP.
I think the way I look at it, I mean, I understand your thoughts here, but I think the way I look at it is PEP is more like it's a concept, right? It's an architectural concept that you have a policy enforcement point. Now, you're right. It could be an application, it could be a gateway, it could be a cloud layer, it could be a WASM module, which is doing all of that. Uh, and it's also possible. So the reason I want to keep this separate is no matter how much of policy stability we get in, there is a little bit of dynamic context with the applications which finally allow or deny access, to put it very simply. So blending in that context and finally taking the action is in the control of a layer, in my mind, which is consuming the output from a PEP. It could be the same. They're not doing a thing over it, and so the PEP is an application. But if you're adding a fine layer in terms of the behavior which the user sees, right? The user experience which the user sees is in the control of the element which is consuming the output of PEP. So I totally understand what you're saying, but I think of PEP more as a concept than as a tool.
It sounds like you don't trust the application developer to listen to the PDP. Oh,
The things like, I've spent so much time in the industry. I think there is a difference between ideal state and where we are right now. So I think it's a journey, to be honest. And like we started, right? I mean, starting from if else to static roles to role based to relationship based, like Zanzibar style, fine grain authorization. It's a journey. So ideal state, I would love to trust the application to be the consumer of decisions from PDP, but I don't think we are there right now.
as somebody who's worked on the enterprise side too, I have to say, um, an external architectural component like a plugin to a web server was a nightmare to upgrade at scale.
Absolutely.
So you're getting into the weeds of what's really in the application developers world. Also, getting developers to use this weird architectural piece called the PEP was equally awkward and unpopular with developers. So I just think it's time to treat developers like grown-ups and say, look, this is how you get a decision. We have logs about the decision that was made, and we have your application logs, and we can look at those things and detect if there's a conflict. If you allowed something and the PDP said no, well, then obviously we're going to hold you accountable as the software developer. So I'm really anti-PEP. I think PEP is leftover from XACML when it was useful when we were a web-only world, but we're beyond that now. And the idea that we would interject some awkward like third-party software into agents, which are writing them themselves these days, I don't know. I think it's past its prime. But
Yeah.
let's pivot a little bit. I wanted to pivot to graphs. My theory is that the biggest misunderstanding in the industry is what are graphs for?
Mhm.
Um, and I quite, simply see graphs as the provider of facts. You have the data you outlined or stored in some way. You have documents and you have users, and the graph answers a question, a fact like, can this user access this document? And that's a fact that goes into your policy evaluation. That's
Mhm.
not the policy. That's a fact about the world. The fact is this user has access to this because the graph says so. So I believe that the output of the graph is actually a fact. It's a way to obtain a fact, similar to how a JWT is a way to assert for an IDP to assert a fact,
Mhm.
either a claim about a piece of software or an authentication event or something. But I feel like there's people conflate graph-based authorization with actual policy-based authorization. And I don't know. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on graphs is sort of the thing that happened in the authorization world, really after our centralized PDP. And where do you think graphs fit in this? Was my view crazy, or I don't know, do you agree or not agree?
I think uh, the way I look at it is, I think, like you rightly said, graph is conflated, right? So the concept of graph is really, if I have to put it simply, uh, it's it's um, it's a it's a relationship of objects with each other, right? So like you said, you traverse a path, and if there exists a relationship from object A to object B, then yeah, you found a path. But a graph can be used for different purposes. I'll delve a little bit into my life as well. In my career, we have built identity graphs, which is really around user, and user has these books access, and really the relationship, like you said, the data modeling was done using Neo4j. In Procore, we used like a graph Neo4j to basically talk about these are the users and these are part of these projects and these are the collaborators. So again, a relationship and access to documents, and who's the owner of the document and who can read a document. All those relationships were modeled as graphs. So graph is a generic term, right? It's a data model which is used to serve data very quickly back to the caller, is how I look at graph. Now, how graphs are used in the authorization world, there are two ways I'm hearing of graphs. One is the context graphs, right? So those are not really policies, but when we do intent aware authorization, what I'm hearing is that we have built context graphs, which is around mapping. So going a little technical, you hash up the intent, you hash up the capability, and you keep a match between the intent and capability, and manage the drift and the risk score using all the data of this graph. Some people have used like Merkle tree root structure to create those graphs to be able to monitor intent, and some people have used other mathematical formula and empirical formulas to calculate that concept of graph, which is really in English trying to capture the intent based on the policy. You have the policy, associated policy with the user, the intent of the agent, and all of that, and it's all packaged well together. And that's evaluated to figure out whether the agent has access or not, all along, continuous evaluation. Another concept I'm hearing of graphs is a post. Like, so this is a pre, right? This is your evaluation while before you have given access. The next is the post, where is the accountability which comes in. So which is a graph which is created using your logs. What did you access, what did you have access to, and be able to say that whether this was a rogue access or not. So more like a post activity. So this is where I'm seeing graph being thrown around. There are a lot of companies who are building graphs to support authorization, but it's more like a pre-world, post-world of having given access. And then the graph, otherwise, like I mentioned, is a generic data model which can be used for any kind of quick access.
Yeah, and I think graphs are essential because it's the best way to map this type of data, relationships, and also hierarchical
True.
types of rules. Having started my career in LDAP, I'm like, yeah, we used to have deep trees, and those deep trees looked a little bit like a type of graph in a way.
Absolutely.
So no, I like graphs, but I just feel like the confusion is if you look at authzen, so we have a park request. You mentioned principal, action, resource, context, and you can send a park request to a graph. Can this principal do this action? Read on this resource. Document 101. And a graph could return a response to you based on that. It can say, oh yeah, I did that traversal and that traversal exists. And so access granted or allowed.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people conflate that with policy, right? What's the policy that determines whether a person has access to a document? And so, like, where's the policy store? Is my policy just all my data, or is how do I actually evaluate what my policies are? So I think there's somewhat of a disconnect in the industry where people misunderstand what that the graphs can only answer the information that's in the graph. You can never. I can't tell you whether a human will be able to modify this document that exists in the future because the graph will always say, I don't have a path for that.
Right.
And so, I don't know. I could see graphs being used for some quick decisions if your policy is simply, does the relationship exist? But I think it's not really a policy.
Correct.
Yeah.
And you said it correctly, right? I mean, it's about, again, right, back to our concepts of you need a place to define your policies, and which is where, we talk of CEDAR and easy language and LP, because a human, hopefully, still is defining policies and saying, okay, this is what the access control should look like via the policy the language. But a graph is more an architectural methodology of being able to quickly read the policies and give decisions. So a graph is not policy. Graph is a representation of policy for easy access to the policy decision. That's how I will separate the two concepts out. So my policies can keep
Mhm.
existing, I can keep changing them, but a graph is more around. Uh, these are my policies, which are probably stale, so I need to re-pick them up from the main source. But this is my data, which needs to give the policy decision. And the reason I created this graph structure is because I want to give a quick decision, and I have have a methodology to give a path, like you said, from a user to an object, and we know that this relationship exists.
Right, right. That's interesting, and yeah, and that's sort of what. So there's in a way, the policies are the rules that enable you to create the graph,
Absolutely.
because yeah, you shouldn't be able to create a relationship that's against policies.
Absolutely.
Um, and then I like your idea that the graph is like, I think of the graph almost as like an index sometimes. Um,
Absolutely. I mean, we've all worked in SQL world, and what is data without a structured query language, right? It's that kind of a thing. You have data, and then you write SQL, because that's like, how do you fetch that data? So it's a similar terminology. You have data, which is your policy sitting somewhere, CEDAR, Rego, well, CSV, whatnot, and then you have these graphs, which are the representation or the language which picks up that data.
Um, so we did chat at IAW about Cedar. Of course, I'm a big fan of Cedar. We've done a bunch of episodes here. My favorite is episode 146 with Amina Torlak, and so anyone interested, every episode has a wiki page. It's glue.co/IOH- the episode number. So this is episode 195. You can see my takeaways in our notes. Um, but the key feature you mentioned about Cedar is analyzability, and it sort of it raises the question of can we use formal verification of policies, and is that really a good idea? Because formal verification, is it really agile enough for this agentic world? It's unclear. Um, so maybe you've been at this a long time. I'm sure these ideas have been floating around since the days of OpenSSO. What's your feeling about what's the place of formal verification or analyzability with regard to policy right now?
So, like the topic says, it's been a crazy road, right? I was part of the committee which was trying to write the XML specs. It was a universal dream, a policy, a language where you can translate policies across.
An
So,
XML language.
yeah, I mean, it was like, it was very heavyweight, a lot of friction because of it being, like you rightly said, it was XML. Um, so I think you raise a valid point, and that occurs to me as well. The fluidity which is required in the definition of policies, especially with the agents and the non-deterministic behavior, which we keep saying all the time, makes me wonder whether the analyzability and versioning of policies is something which can sustain long term, and how quickly can we change, and how do we handle changes in policies. It's great that you have these stamped policy sets, and if something changes we would know, but it's about speed and how quickly things can be agile, to your word, right? We've always been saying, that agents have brought us to an agile world of things changing. Sometimes we don't even know what policy needs to be created before we start. It has to be generated on the fly. So I have my reservations. I don't think I have seen a solve. In fact, I haven't even seen Cedar being used in a very. Cedar is a great language, but I think um, I have yet to, and I may be wrong, yet to see a product which has gone production quality and scaling and handling changes with versioning at this point. So yes, that definitely stays a concern with me as well.
Yeah, one of the issues we're trying to address in the Cedar community is, what does a policy store even look like?
Yeah.
I think we've had this idea for years that policy authoring should be a centralized activity, that even maybe the CISO in some cases should review policies, but we should treat policies more like code, where they should be reviewed and approved and then distributed like software out to the rest of the enterprise. But it's not clear actually that we have a standard for policy stores. Um, but maybe before I go into the policy stores, I'll just get your reaction to that idea that the activity of authoring policies should be centralized and not distributed to the edge. That's what's sort of been the trajectory from, I think we've been saying that for at least 25 years, but has anyone actually heard that? And what's the state of play, I guess, with the market actually buying into that idea that somehow policy should be a centralized activity?
I think there are pros and cons to both. I mean, what I have seen is organizations, enterprises do definitely have a central policy authoring store because, that there's one place. But then the other thing is, to your point on edge applications, each of them, the way I see the world, let's put it this way, I don't think we are there yet. The way I see the world is that once you define the language, right? Once you know how the policy needs to be authored, it's to each your own, and then we need to worry about, like, an application has created their own local policy store. Doesn't matter how they've stored it, because now we have authn to transfer policies around. So if you have local stores of policies, which are like your administration points, in the language which the applications need, in the granularity the applications need, what we really need to solve is the problem of how do we put all the policies together, so really accumulate and distribute and really have an engine which can keep picking policies from all your locations where local policy stores exists and creates a central repository, but be aware of things changing in, a lot of events and new data floating around because policies have been rewritten somewhere. It's going to be a very complex world, but ideally that is the only world that can survive. Having a central policy authorization store mostly fails because of single point of failure, and also it cannot have the nuance of the local applications or local agents or what have you, right, on your edge, who are consuming the policies. Mike, you're muted, I think.
Yes, that is probably the biggest change where we actually, in the 2000s, I think we did see policy evaluation happening centrally. But I was actually saying policy authoring. I actually believe policy stores, instead of having one big policy store, you have a lot of little policy stores that each only have the policies for the application that needs them. And then those policy stores, those bite-sized policy stores, get distributed out to the edge.
And I can go a step further and say, we shouldn't be mandating what those policy stores look like, because what's the point in creating authn if we don't give the flexibility of having any kind of policy store? So to each their own. Have your own policy store, as long as you have an interoperable language to distribute those policies to the local pdp or your store, which is broadcasting policies to other, so speak the same language basically.
Yeah, and authn, it standardizes the shape of the request.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely neutral on how you express the policies or the policy store. Although I have proposed, Alex Olivier, if he's listening, I'm reminding him again that we have proposed the idea of a standardized policy store, let's say zip format, because potentially even if there's different implementations of policies, you could have a similar binary asset that sort of, well, we have policies in this folder, we have schema in this folder, we have templates in this folder, and different PDPs, how those, whether those are cell policies or CEDAR policies or Cerbos policies, that can differ. But at least we know what that asset looks like, because from a software distribution standpoint, we need integrity of the policy stores. I just noticed we're way over on time, and I apologize for that. I'm normally pretty good about the time, but this is I guess it's my favorite topic. So I'm just going to dive right into last thoughts. this is we only scratched the surface. But any last thoughts before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I mean, I think my last thoughts would be more on the industry's readiness. I mean, we've talked about a lot of things. I think the good news definitely is that we have a lot of tools which exist. The bad news is most companies are still, like I mentioned, copy pasting if statements, calling it auth and we, you ask any developer where their authorization logic lives, half will say middleware and half will be like quiet and we have no clue where the authorization is happening. So we really need to um, um, be on this journey. And my last thoughts would only be like, I would love to see a solve. And I'm like super passionate about the space, like you can tell. And this conversation was awesome. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. And, over a few years, hopefully we'll have the problem solved. And like they say, right, the next won't have a hacker in a hoodie. It'll be an AI agent trying to overplease you and doing something which you never intended it to do. So we don't want to hit that stage, is what I will say.
Yeah, I hope we've at least moved the ball forward a little bit. I don't know about solved. So,
I would love
it's
to see
so
this.
hard. I feel like there's a whole cultural transformation happening as our society becomes more digital. And we're at the beginning of this digital journey, transformation of our culture. And I feel like I hope we push the ball up the hill a little bit and then pass it over to millennials, um, and then to Gen Z.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Things are moving, and I'm glad we still have passionate people in this space.
Okay, I just want to announce next episode EIC debrief for those of us who couldn't make it to Berlin last week. Um, we will have Sebastian Rohr and perhaps Hank from Sonic Bee next week. I'm going to ask all the questions about the sessions that I wanted to go to that they probably didn't go to anyway. Um, and one final reminder: if you're still with us at minute, 52, and you haven't followed IOH or on LinkedIn or YouTube, please do that right now. And with that, I will say thank you very much, Bhavna. It's been a pleasure to get to chat with you about this, and hope we have many more conversations. And thank you, audience, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks a lot. Really had a great engaging conversation. Looking forward to more. Thank you.